Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. Thank you for being on time. I know it is a little unusual for us to just fly right into the programming, but we do have a packed evening tonight, so thank you once again. My name is William Shikani. I'm the chair of the Activities Committee here at the Yale Club, and I'm delighted that you're all joining us for this evening. A great talk on James Gamble Rogers, done by Patrick Pinnell. I'm not going to introduce him. I'm going to give that the honor to Caroline, because she has done a lot of the legwork for this week, and she deserves a lot of praise for that. But I am going to first give the mic to Kathy Edersheim, the head of the 50 Vanderbilt Foundation, to just say a few things about the foundation and the great work that it's hoping to do here to help keep the Yale Club the wonderful place that it is. Kathy?
I will be very brief. We all are the beneficiaries of James Gamble Rogers' amazing work, which we will hear much more about, and it needs help to survive. The Yale Club is a fabulous place that we all enjoy as members, but we don't necessarily want to have to support what it takes to preserve a 100-plus-year-old building. So almost 10 years ago, the 50 Vanderbilt Foundation was created as a way for people to give money to support the building, primarily the facade. We do a couple of other things for raising money to make it tax advantaged for our members and donors. You probably got a letter from me a couple of weeks ago asking you to give some money. We hope you did. There is a banner outside that you can see, and we have brochures. So we are, in a sense, co-sponsors of this evening, thanks to Carolyn's great work. And we hope you enjoy this and join us in supporting our beautiful building and keeping it what it is. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I've seen a lot of faces over the weekend because we did a series of tours and talks. But tonight, it's really Yale Club Day today. In November of 1915, on November 18th, the first Yale Club Day was celebrated. And it just seemed really important to recognize James Gamble Rogers and this beautiful building. And I couldn't think of a better person to do that than Patrick Pinnell. We were so lucky 2 years ago to have him come and talk for Happy Hour for the Mind about the stonework he did on the 2 new buildings at Yale. And he did such an amazing job. And in the process of talking to him, I realized how much he knew about James Gamble Rogers. So when we started talking about finding someone for tonight, I was like, oh, no, I got somebody. He's good. So Patrick Pinnell graduated from Yale in 1971. He got his master's in architecture in 1974 and has gone on to have this really great career in Connecticut. And I'm going to let you talk a little bit more about yourself and the whole process of this, because you can also talk about why you know so much about James Gamble Rogers. But thank you guys for coming tonight. And afterwards at 7:30, there's a party down in the main lounge. We've got period music, period cocktails, and it's just going to be fun. And happy Yale Club Day.
Thank you, Caroline. Okay, I've got to make sure that all senses are go here. Patrick Pinnell, 71, 74 March. I will just, I decided to put a slide in at the end, at the very end, which will demonstrate the long-standing nature of my interest in Yale and its architecture. Though my undergraduate dean used to say to me, Pinnell, you're really a short attention span major. Because I came in as I was intending to be an astrophysics major. I got put in directed studies without being asked. That turned me on to classical literature. My very first seminar was reading the Odyssey with Eric Siegel as the seminar leader, and it just went on from there. I got seriously interested in architecture, though, taking Vincent Scully's. How many have took Vincent Scully's classes? Oh, all right. For those of you who haven't, this is one of America's great architectural historians, architecture and urbanism. And many of his lectures are available online. So I would urge you to look those up. I went on when I was in grad school to become Vince's, what they called the bird dog in the slide room. That is, get me a slide of a Greek temple vertical with the light coming from the upper left, and I'd go over to the old-fashioned slides and bring it over, drop it on the light table for, and to see him assembling a talk was just one of the great experiences. Well, with that, I'll give you a little bit of Latin doggerel, which is tace e faci, which is just means shut up and do it. I think that's my task right now. I'm going to read the very beginnings of what I'm going to talk about here, and then I'm just going to launch into the slides and let them do the cueing. As Carolyn said, well, actually, I gave a talk in 2015 on the 100th anniversary of the Yale Club building. So the kind of basic genetic material of this with respect to the Yale Club building dates from 9 years ago now. I've decided to do a kind of compare and contrast with a much better known architect, as famous as James Gamble Rogers is, Frank Lloyd Wright. Let me just start reading, and then I'll let the slides cue it. 9 years ago, I began by asking these 3 questions. First, what does the Yale Club building tell us? It's a wonderful structure in a great location, and by that I mean not only Midtown, adjacent to Grand Central, but also in Manhattan, in New York City. What, if anything, can be learned from it? That's a question embedded in a second, larger question. To what extent is a building really part of the intellectual heritage of not only a university, but a culture? And containing still a third one, does the Yale Club in New York tell us something about the campus back in New Haven, perhaps even the character of Yale itself? I think it's possible to at least sketch answers to these questions. All right. There we go. One way to go about this is to compare the work and design propensities of the club's architect and that of many Yale buildings, James Gamble Rogers, with those of his very near contemporary, Frank Lloyd Wright. Here they are in the late 1920s, Wright on the right, the Rogers on the left. Wright at this moment is probably at the low point of his entire long career in the late 20s. Rogers, by contrast, was hard at work not only on an early version of Sterling Library, which is what you see the perspective behind him, and other works on the Yale campus, but projects across the country. But let's go backwards just a bit. There we go. Here they are both right around 1900, 33 years old, and are now what we call emerging professionals. Rogers was born on March 3rd, 1867, Wright on June 8th, 1867. 3 months later, James Gamble Rogers was a Yale College 1889 graduate and a member of Scroll and Key. That spook, as they're called, was already in its exotic 1870s tomb, which was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, who was the founder of the American Institute of Architects. Wright, in contrast to Rogers, dropped out of the University of Wisconsin after 2 semesters in 1887 and never finished. Both were provincial, as it used to be said, of provincial birth. Richland Center, Wisconsin, for Wright, Bryan Station, Kentucky, for Rogers. Both matured professionally in Chicago in the 1890s. Both eventually had a special relationship with New York City, as I'll describe in a bit. New York City was clearly the place to be conquered. So, come on. There we go. Both, unbelievably, belonged to a little architect supper club called the 18. So they knew each other very well in what were really significant developmental years. Wright in the 1890s was developing what later came to be called the Prairie School, the Prairie Style. Rogers was becoming an incredibly facile architect. He could do classicism, he could do Gothic. He had a good eye and a very strong spatial imagination. This is the building called Steinway Hall, which was on the top floor of which the little supper club met. Well, I should have said one thing. This is a very nice credential. Wright's archives, until they were moved up to Columbia, were out in the desert at Taliesin West. I was the first outsider allowed in to research in the Taliesin archives, and that's a line on my resume that I'm very, very proud of. Okay, anyway, Steinway Hall, Rogers and Wright together in Chicago. Come on, there we go. Rogers opened, I'm gonna kind of go quickly over their early careers. Began to get commissions for large houses in Chicago to make social connections and get some experience with institutional buildings. This is an early educational building for the University of Chicago in collegiate Gothic style, which eventually became the style of the Yale campus. There we go. In 1904, Rogers opened his own office in Chicago in 1898, mostly designing houses, but also a couple of Rogers things. In 1905, he moved to New York City. And one of his very first commissions was a house for Edward S. Harkness. You will remember that name. The Harkness family is not New Yorkers. They were from Cleveland, and they were early investors with a guy named Rockefeller in this funny idea of pulling black stuff up out of the ground and refining it for fuel and money. The Harkness house, here it is at 75th and 5th. So here it is in an aerial shot. This is the Harkness Mansion. It's right next door to the Cooper Hewitt Museum. And this amazing building, I just had to show this, Temple Beth El from 1897, was in the background. It was replaced by an apartment building, but you can see it peeking out from behind the Harkness house. Here's the funny thing about this. It's a palazzo, but it's not a, when you think of palazzo, you think of palace as something that really pops out into the foreground. It's not. Unlike the Cooper Hewitt building, which was the Carnegie steel, you got steel and oil on one corner here. It pulls back, it makes a big kind of sculptural deal of itself. Now, here's a question I'll ask and just ask you to ponder. This is on the southwest corner of 75th. Is there another building on a southwest corner looking across Fifth Avenue to Central Park that you can think of? Guess what? And I'm not claiming any influence here. It's just sort of karmic coincidence. What you get is, to repeat myself, it's a private background building in the form of a palazzo, and then here's the public museum building. Now, the Guggenheim Museum was finished in late 1959. Wright had died many months previously. His was an incredibly long career. He was 92 years old when he died and was active right up until the end. It was really 70 years between the Guggenheim's planning and that of his own, gotta go back, his own Oak Park house. And here's the house. This is 1889, so 70 years between those two designs. It's an incredibly monumental house. When you look at that pyramidal form, that's almost a 90-degree corner up top on a big brick base. It's not too much to say that that's monumental. And here's Wright and his young family on those steps, maybe 1890 or something. You can't see it in this photograph, but like Rogers, he has a very stylish little Clark Gable mustache on. This, I would say, is the beginning of, I'm going to assert that Rogers and Wright had diametrically opposed basically propensities in what they want to do with their building. Wright consistently wanted to monumentalize domesticity, to take the private and background stuff, particularly his own experience, and turn it into something grander and more significant. Now, the story, the conventional story of American architecture in the 1890s was that there was the beginning of modern architecture coming on, but then the 1893 Chicago World's Fair happened, and this kind of nascent modernism, Chicago school, steel frame, all that, was killed by it. It's a kind of myth of the lost cause. And in fact, it was a lot more complicated situation. Here's the Fine Arts Building by a guy named Charles Bowler Atwood from 1892 for the 1893, the so-called White City World's Fair. Can you read who the architect on that is? That is Frank Lloyd Wright, 1893. This is an entry for the Milwaukee Public Library competition. And it's a straight ripoff. If anything, I won't go into detail here, Wright's is more sophisticated than Atwood's. But just keep that image in line. So here is the Atwood building, the 93 World's Fair building. Here's what's often considered the first of Wright's Prairie School houses, the Ward Willets house of 1902. Is there a kind of sneaky resemblance between those two things? I think that there is. And I'll just say one other sort of prefiguring thing. It's important to distinguish between between kinds of types. There is use type. So when you talk about a school building or a government building, that's a type of use. There's also organizational type, which is kind of the geometric organization and the hierarchies within a building of how its components work. So here, each of these, the technical term for that and that is the frontispiece. So this is the foreground stuff, this is the background stuff. They're the same genetics, I'd contend, in this. And it's Wright, monumentalizing the domestic. Okay, in 1898, he added on to his 1889 house, which I just showed. This is an, 1898 studio, which was fundamentally 2 octagons, a big octagonal drafting room, and then a private library, which was also Wright's office, and then an entry in between. That's his own house, kind of peeking over the top there. The funds to build that were from Wright's design. This is his drawing on the left for something called the Luxfer Prism building, PRISM. It was never built. The basic idea, and a bunch of us were on a tour that Carolyn gave this afternoon of the lighting fixtures, and she made the point that it was kind of a big deal for the Yale Club to have all electric lighting fixtures in 1915. The Luxfer Prism building, even earlier, recognized the expense of, at that point, it was mostly gas lighting. So the idea of these prisms, here's one, was to take skylight, and with these little faceted edges, it kicked daylight deeper into an office building. So the whole idea was to save on natural gas or this very expensive, at that point, new stuff called electricity. And this is actually a patent drawing that was done by Frank Lloyd Wright for the Luxfer Prism company. All these infill windows, this is the basic steel frame. All these are the prisms, tiny little pieces of that. Here's the Guggenheim. Back to the Guggenheim, 1959. Though this is a developmental drawing, and if you look closely, you can see that there's something, you can see this is an early version. There's, in the built version, there's a kind of bulge at this corner, and there's an additional layer of spiral here. What's that in the background? It's the Luxfer Prism building. And he always, in the developmental drawings, showed this building in the background of the Guggenheim. Why? Well, here's the plan of the Guggenheim. Here, flipped, mirror image, is the plan of his own studio. So octagon, octagon, center entrance. Okay, now it's spiral, small spiral, big spiral, small octagon, big octagon. The Guggenheim is his own studio monumentalized. It's domesticity monumentalized. Here they are, not flipped, but it's the same organizational type, just with the geometry changed and the material changed. That, as I said, that's his own house, kind of peeking over the top. Okay, now I'm going to do a cut back to James Gamble Rogers. Rogers, as I said, was a Yale graduate class of 1889, so he arrived in the mid-1880s when the Yale campus, although at that point it was still called the Yale Yard, was in process of transformation from, you've probably heard of it, the old brick row. So this was the old brick row. South Middle is the only building which survives. We know it as Connecticut Hall. So it was an alternation of dormitory building with classroom or chapel. This was the Lyceum educational building. It was a kind of ABA that at one point stretched all the way from, this is Chapel Street, this is the green down here. The 1842 Yale Library, which was the first Yale Gothic building. And you can see what's going on is that the old brick row is being subtracted north to south, and the new perimeter block that we now know, the old campus is a closed-in space, is taking its place. So Yale is starting to close in on itself rather than being open to the green. Now, but in a funny, and Yale does this, in a funny way, despite that change, it's the same, and it's in this respect. Here are two, this is actually the same colonial center house plan type. I've just put two beside each other. This is Connecticut Hall. The original, what became Yale College buildings, it was just called the Collegiate School in Saybrook, was held in ministers' houses. And the very first Yale building from 1717 was essentially a bunch of center hall plan houses just kind of crammed together where Bingham Hall is now. And the constant is the center stairway with a couple fireplaces. So look at Connecticut Hall, center stairway, fireplaces. And then look at the plan. This is the Memorial Quadrangle, which we now know as Saybrook and Brantford colleges. The entryway system is absolutely the same. So if you like, you can read the Memorial Quadrangle and the subsequent Yale College buildings, which all still operate on that entryway system. They've got the genetic material of a colonial house. There are some exceptions. Silliman College is a kind of accumulation of other buildings left over from the Sheffield Scientific School. Okay, now I'm going to pan back even a little bit further and talk about some propensities that Yale may have inherited from New Haven with the famous 9-square plan, 1638. This is my drawing for one of the ornaments on the two new colleges. 9 squares, about a half mile on a side, the New Haven green in the center. Where did this come from? And I think there's actually a pretty good answer to that. John Davenport and Theophilus Eaton, respectively the secular and the clergyman who founded New Haven, 1638, were in exile from England. They were Puritans, and the Church of England did not take kindly to them. They were in exile in Holland. Holland at that point in the 1620s was part of the Spanish Empire. And there was two big sets of folios published by a guy named Juan Bautista Villalpando called, "This is the encampment of the tribes of Israel in the wilderness. This is the Temple of Jerusalem, Solomon's Temple." He published those together, and if you look at them, basically, they're both 9-square plans. This one is domestic, because it's the tents of the tribes of Israel in the wilderness surrounding the Ark of the Covenant. This is Solomon's Temple with the altar at the center. See, fundamentally, they're the same organizational plan type, but one is domestic, one is monumental. So I copied those basically and added an elm leaf for New Haven for the ornament on those two happen to be on Franklin College. And back to the Yale campus today. One thing that it's hard to think the term is appropriate, but it's a fundamentally domestic place. Let's start with Sterling Library, designed by James Gamble Rogers. There are a total of 7 stairs to get from the street level up to the main level of the Sterling nave. Compare and contrast that with the New York Public Library, or this is the McKim and White Low Library at Columbia. There's a real convention of treating university libraries as allegories of the journey to knowledge. So you need a great big staircase to get up to the Temple of Wisdom. Here, and this is the cover of the first edition of my Yale guidebook, which I've deliberately got the library front with its low number of steps with Maya Lin's quite brilliant, the women's table. Maya, who's quite brilliant, the idea of commemorating women, the number of women at Yale, as you know, if you've been there, there's a water spirals out from the center and then spills over the edge. And there's a set of numbers that spiral out from 1701 in the middle, the source of the water, the date of Yale's foundation. And it lists the number of women students at Yale. And of course, for the longest time, it's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. But then it starts to pick up. And I just think that it's brilliantly appropriate that Maya would suggest something domestic as the as an emblem for Yale and its men and women. Okay. Try it again. There we go. Now, this is something you may not believe, but the next time you're in New Haven, just try it. Not only is there a low number of steps going into Sterling Library, but it's deliberately designed so that as you're, in this perspective, which is from the Rogers office, it's set at eye level. That line is eye level of all these figures. And I've drawn in purple lines that mark the outer edges of the Sterling stack tower, the outer edges of the frontispiece of Sterling. And can you see the way that right there in front, the frontispiece of Sterling Library precisely blocks out the stack tower, bringing the scale down. See what I'm saying? I didn't believe it the first time that I figured this out, but then you go back and look at the perspectives, and this can't be faked. This is his perspective. So it's another domesticating the monument, bring down the scale. If you can follow what I'm saying. Okay, back down to the Yale Club. Rogers, as I said, became more than competent. He was a very good designer in a variety of styles. This is a post office building in New Orleans that he designed. And you can see the similarity of that to that. It's a palazzo. The same kind of arcade form at the ground floor, and pilasters, and a kind of the term of art as for these pilasters or columns on the upper level is a piano nobile. It is also a classical column, which was a conventional way of characterizing the skyscraper when it first came about. You have a base, a shaft of repetitive stuff, and then a capital up at the top. So while it's a building, it's also a kind of large classical column. And this was again, I don't want to get it too complicated, but columns were thought of as analogs to human beings. So Doric was a warrior, and Corinthian was a anorexic maiden, all that. So it was a convention which even Frank Lloyd Wright's teacher, Louis Sullivan, used. Come on. There we go. This is Sullivan's Wainwright building in Chicago. And St. Louis. You can see how unified this is compared to the Yale Club building. First of all, it's all one color. But second, look at the way that the windows are treated here versus the Yale Club building. Come on. I think I've gone backwards. Come on. I was going to compare them, but I'm sorry, this is really getting glitchy. No, I don't. I want to go forward. Well, okay, yeah, this is good. This is good. That's the Wainwright building on top, and then the Yale Club scissored down. And can you see the difference? The one is treated as unified with the verticals accentuated. The Yale Club building, the individual room windows are just holes punched in the skin. So in a funny way, the domesticity of this is what's coming through. All right, on to another aspect of the club. Just to remind you, Urban Palazzo. Right across the street from Grand Central Station. This is the answer to why the upper levels of the Yale Club are up. It's because of that across the street. The quite brilliant idea of having the taxi ramps on a second level above the street. The Yale Club is back over here. See, it's monumentalized, and Rogers knows that he should not try to compete with the dominant form in the area. So implicit in the building itself is not only this internal organization, but a reference to the outside. So it's deferring to Grand Central. This is a wonderful, on the right, colored cross-section through the main reading room, and you can see that Grand Central is an amazing spatial interior and exterior organization. Okay. Architects are not always smart about, like as Rogers always was, about the context. So what you see here is a pre-1958 view up Park Avenue. There's Grand Central with the Grand Central Tower and the taxi ramp coming down. Notice that it doesn't block the light around. So the Grand Central Station Tower, the office tower, signals a very long distance, both north and south. When the Pan Am, now the MetLife building, went in, you can see that it doesn't. It blocks. It's wider than the street. It's basically being selfish. Okay. And it's even worse from the north. If you see there's the Grand Central Tower with the MetLife building, changing the whole character of Upper Park Avenue. Okay. Good cities are legible. You can figure out where you are, what's important, what's less important, what's public and what's private. It's a kind of a two-part system where you get background buildings, urban fabric without the monuments. This is something called, it's from a plan of Rome. It's just diagrammed. And then here it is with the monuments, the Pantheon, pulled out separately. Here it is combined. And Rogers was really a believer in the combination, which meant that he had to defer to, so again, domesticating monumentality, the opposite of Wright's monumentalizing domesticity. It's fun to compare a design by another member of the same generation, Adolf Loos. This was the great Viennese architect. His entry for the Chicago Tribune Publishing Company building was a column, pun on newspaper column, but it's all about itself again. Rogers was not doing that. Loos was a near contemporary of Wright and Rogers. Okay, back to Frank Lloyd Wright again. The last 5 years of his life, Wright actually had a suite at the Plaza Hotel right there below the little corner turret, which he designed. He didn't change the windows, but the interior was all Frank Lloyd Wright furnishings, and it's what he used as a home base in New York when he was here. Frank Lloyd Wright in New York, The Plaza Years, rather a good book, forward by Mike Wallace, to supervise the Guggenheim's construction. Now, funny thing about the Plaza Hotel, here it is with, as I said, Wright's room was there. This is the St. Gaudens General Sherman monument that Wright would have seen. The crack was always, just like a Yankee, let a woman go in front of him. Yeah. Well, let's take another look at the Plaza Hotel. Does it remind you of anything? I've doubled up Frank Lloyd Wright's own house here. Maybe it's just karmic coincidence again, but he seems to have been attracted to this place not only because it was a nifty hotel, but because it too has a kind of little bit of a propensity to monumentalize the domestic character of all those rooms behind. All right, come on. Back to Rogers. How many of you know where the commemorative plaque to Rogers is? It's oddly hidden. This is it. It's in this funny little courtyard between Saybrook and Brantford, out of sight. It's at the foot of what's called Wrexham Tower, which is that limestone tower in the corner. And the next time you're in New Haven, it's by Lee Lowry, the plaque, who did a lot of the sculpture for Sterling Library. Here's another thing that you can notice. It's very subtle, but Rogers does this all the time in his planning of the colleges. There are 11 portals going into what are now Brantford and Saybrook colleges, the Memorial Quadrangle from 1917. 10 of the 11 are in corners. Only this one is in the center. What that does is very subtly demonumentalize the experience of the courtyard. Instead of marching straight ahead up the axis towards something tall, you're coming in, and all these receding diagonals are what you get in perspective when you come in there, or here's Harkness Tower. This is the gateway over towards the old campus. Do you see what I mean? Whether this is conscious, I think it is conscious on Rogers' part, it brings down the scale. Okay, getting close to closing time here. And going to cut back to some larger possible connections. Here are two monasteries. And a monastery, let's just recognize, is fundamentally, it's a building type which is about an extended family. The monks with the abbot as the father figure were thought of them, they dined together, they worked together, and in terms of the components of the characteristic monastery, there was always something called a chapter house. Here, this is a kind of typical monastery near the monumental building. This is Westminster Abbey with its chapter house there. Many times they were octagonal. And what happened in a chapter house was a kind of echo chamber. It was the abbot reading a chapter of the Bible to the chapter of monks listening to him in the chapter house. So it's a kind of Russian Easter egg of scales of people and objects fundamentally emblematic of the place as a community. Now, one last digression, and this is bringing in still another member, that same generation of 1870 plus or minus, John Russell Pope. This is the Yale campus that did not happen. There was a group of young, they called themselves Young Yale, reformers who wanted to really modernize the campus and stylistically make it more uniform, and wanted to monumentalize the campus. So this is a John Russell Pope 1919 plan for Yale. And I'll show you a detail that you'll be able to read more legibly first, but let me just point out some things that are where we are. This is the New Haven Green with the, that's Center Church. This is Vanderbilt Hall, old campus. And what's going on here is that poor startled Durfee Hall has been blown away. That's Elm Street going through. And these are some of the old divinity school buildings since replaced by Calhoun College there. And what John Russell Pope wanted to do was have an enormous library building there straight ahead. So you could see from Vanderbilt Hall over to this new library building, which blocked the relatively brand new bicentennial buildings, which we know as Commons and the Wolsey Hall Rotunda. So you got this zang, big axis that way. He had a gym here, zang, another big axis this way to a big public square down at the foot of the New Haven Green. Then, boom, run Hillhouse Avenue all the way through up to a brand new tower there. So it was it would have been an incredibly visually connected campus. And now here comes the detail on that. On the left is Pope's plan. Here's Elm Street, old campus is over here. As I said, what he wanted to do was, this is the new library building, cover up Commons, Rotunda, and Woolsey Hall. Big new complex up here, big access down to this new plaza, and then that all the way up to Hillhouse Avenue. This is the mostly Rogers plan on the right, and look how much more closed it is. Yeah, you get something between Sterling Library, that's Sterling, and the Cross Campus, but that building, I forget what the name of it is. Maybe it's the Colony. It was allowed to remain. These are the music school buildings. The axes are foreclosed. Durfee gets to stay alive over here. This was a new extension of Hillhouse Avenue. There's no brand new big square here. You see what I'm saying? The basic propensity of the Rogers plan is to close in lesser scale, to domesticate the place. The Pope plan, as you might guess from somebody who did the Jefferson Memorial and the National Gallery of Art and on, had a tendency to monumentalize things. Okay, really coming to a close here. I'll remind you at the top of the Atwood design for the 93 World's Fair, the Frank Lloyd Wright Milwaukee Public Library. Both of them have their roots really in the east front of the Louvre. And Wright knew that. This is back to Wright monumentalizing domesticity. Here's still another addition that he did to his 1889 house. This is his house. Here's the studio. In the early 1890s, he did a playroom / kindergarten education room on the second floor with a beautiful barrel vault, and always had, well, this is a latter-day recreation, he always drew and photographed this room with a piece of plaster statuary there. It's the Nike of Samothrace, the original of which is in the Louvre, the head of the main staircase at the Louvre. What Wright did was place this monumental sculpture, and he knew very well the origin of it, above the place to education. See, he's monumentalizing domesticity once again. This is quite conscious on his part. And if you only need confirmation that it's domesticity personally monumentalized, this is the Falling Water house, one of the most famous houses of the 20th century, designed by Wright, 1937, for Edgar Kaufman, who was the proprietor of a big Pittsburgh department store, famously built above a waterfall. And Wright suggested the name. I think he kind of pulled one over on Edgar, because if you look, Falling Water is Frank Lloyd Wright. Yeah, I don't think that's accident. Well, since next weekend is Harvard-Yale weekend, I want to close this out with just a very quick comparison of the Yale Bowl and Harvard Stadium. Yale Bowl left, Harvard Stadium on the right. The campuses have different genetic character. Harvard is open. The Harvard Stadium is open back to the center of Cambridge across the river. The Harvard Yard has buildings scattered around the edge of it. The Yale campus is all these colleges closing in on itself. The same way the Yale Bowl is, everybody is facing everybody else. All that you get is West Rock kind of peeking over the top, like Kilroy was here. Is it too much to suggest that the stadium, the Yale Bowl, is really a chapter house? Is the Yale Bowl, I don't think this was conscious, but it makes you wonder a little bit about whether there are unconscious patterns to what one college, one university tends to like, tends to favor. Are these things almost Jungian archetypes that, back to that word type again. So with some reluctance, I'm going to show you one more slide, and that is, as I said, to demonstrate a longstanding interest in architecture. This is something taken in the spring of my freshman year, first year, and see the figure out there on the end? That's me. And you can tell how old this is given their tail fins and things on these cars. If I knew then what I know now about Vanderbilt's 1891 rusting steel nails for these Guastavino roof tiles, I would not have shinnied out along that ridge line to wave hi to Chapel Street. So that's all. I ran a little too long. I apologize. Comments, questions?
We're going to have time for about 2 questions. So anybody? Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I just wondered about the James Gamble Rogers family. The ceiling, of course, is James Gamble Rogers above us, and James Gamble Rogers' grandson, I believe, became an architect and was the architect for the club for many years. So
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could talk about their connection with Yale and the ongoing generations of James Gamble Rogers.
I regret to say I don't know. I know that the subsequent generations have been architects. I think I think James Gamble Rogers III is the last, but I regret to say I can't answer the question, what the continuing relationship is. The firm was Butler Rogers Basket, and it would be fun to dig into their archives and see what Carolyn is in process of trying to get copies of all the Rogers drawings from the Yale manuscripts and archives. But I'll see what I can find out, and I'll relay to Carolyn about the Rogers family.
Anyone else?
Here's Jay.
Pat, my students are always fascinated by the Pope plan. And it's so remarkably different. And you pointed out many of those differences. And it just occurs to me, as part of what you're saying here, is that you have these wonderful thoroughfares in the Pope plan, these grand sort of, places to march up and there's something taller, but also diagonals. And in a way, they connect to New Haven in ways that James Gamble Rogers does not. Do you think any of that was on purpose is part of the idea of enclosure, not only to bring the scale down, but to sort of keep the campus separate from the town?
Well, the reason, the simple answer is yes. Yale quite consciously withdrew itself from New Haven after at the beginning of the demolition of the old brick row. It began on St. Patrick's Day in 1847, if you really want to know precisely, when there was a theater on the far side of the New Haven Green, and the Yaleys had the expensive seats, the townies, many of whom were Irish, disagreed on the quality of an act, and there was shouting back and forth between the balcony and the manager of the theater said to the class bully, there actually was an office called that. And he said, better get your guys out of here and get back up to campus. So they started going back up Chapel Street, just where the hotel is now, the Taft Apartments. The students started singing, Gaudiamus igitur juventutum, let us give thanks because we are young. And this so incensed the mob that was following them that they fell on the last few guys in the march of students and started to beat on them. One of them turned out to have been from Texas and had a Bowie knife and stabbed the leader of the mob through the heart and killed him. I'm not making this up. The Yale students and the faculty then barricaded themselves in Connecticut Hall and started pouring lead for bullets. The only reason that, and some of the mob went down the street to an armory, pulled a couple of cannons in from the New Haven Armory, and they were beginning to lay siege to the campus when a fireman did what's called spiking the fuse holes on the cannons so that you couldn't put the igniting thread down there, and the mob dispersed. But the Yale's stayed holed up in Con Hall for a couple days, and that was literally the decision made to do the perimeter block around the old campus. Now, but back to your point, I doubt that Rogers wanted to disconnect from New Haven. He much preferred integration, and I'll give you an example. He designed the New Haven train station. So that's, there were a series of smaller moves that engaged with the town. So with that, maybe it's a terrible death to be talked to death, as Mark Twain used to say, and so I won't do that. I'll just say thank you.
And if any of you are interested at any point in looking at the Pope plan, we actually have 2 copies of it here in the library. It's a quite massive book, but I'll pull it out if you ever want to come and take a look at it. Now I'm going to send you all down to the lounge to enjoy the Yale Club Day party. Thanks, everyone.